Welcome to the third and final webinar in our series for VetSure around practice ownership. For those of you who have already listened to the first two webinars, you'll know that we've already posed the question, should I stay or should I go, concerning whether or not now is the right time for a practice owner to sell their practice and the considerations around that. In the second webinar, we looked at different ownership options and areas that practices could explore. This final webinar looks into bringing people on board, the considerations around the individual, and looks at it from both angles, both that of the practice owners and also that of the potential new practice owners. So firstly, just a little bit about me. My name is Steve Headon. I'm an equity partner at Moore Scarrett, and we're accountants and business advisors specialising in the veterinary sector. Alongside myself, I have four other partners working on the veterinary team, and we act in the region of 400 practices across the UK. We've got a dedicated team in support of some 40 staff, including 15 qualified accountants. Obviously, the focus, as with all accountancy practices as a starting point, is dealing with the compliance services a practice requires, that being the annual accounts and tax returns. However, our focus switches very much to the proactive work, the business development and advisory services. That starts with performance management, looking at management accounts, benchmarking. That then moves into the strategic and tax planning advice on an annual basis. Alongside that, we're looking at what can we do with that information, looking at consultancy services around performance, efficiency management, and then also around practice ownership, which is where these webinars are focusing, looking at mergers, acquisitions, sales, joint ventures, restructuring, and generally succession planning internally within a practice. So at an overview, this webinar will consider the following. Who wants to buy in? What is their motivation? Are they the right person? Secondly, what are the criteria? How are we choosing the people to buy in? Is it an invitation only system? Are we waiting for a request for someone to buy in? What percentage are we offering? Are we waiting until someone else leaves, so it's a one in, one out scenario? Does there need to be a set amount of qualifying time for an individual to work in the business prior to their buy-in? And also, who are we considering? Are we just considering vets? Are we considering non-vets as well? And then once we've looked at that, we look at what is the impact on their remuneration, and more importantly, what is the impact on the practice generally? Finally, we'll then look at how it can all work. Just firstly, looking at the who and why, the scenarios we commonly see are often something of a Mexican standoff. Owners commonly don't want to approach, they assume no one is interested, they assume they would lose out financially from somebody buying in. Employers, on the other hand, don't think they can approach and ask, they don't think it's appropriate, they assume it wouldn't be permitted. There's a wide assumption in many practices that a corporate sale is inevitable at some stage, so it's very much a closed shop. They also assume they cannot afford to buy in. This leads to ignorance, denial. If only we had known that, well, why did you ask? So communication, as with many things in life, becomes absolutely key. If practice owners want to know the question, it can be asked. They don't have to specifically ask an individual, do you want to buy in, but asking what their aspirations are, what they're aiming to achieve, how they would like to become more involved in the practice. All perfectly appropriate questions and can avoid this scenario. Similarly for the employees, asking owners about their future plans, development, their own career progression, the same questions but from their perspective, can avoid a lot of these issues. There's also an issue around the perception of what is involved versus the reality. You very often see two extremes in terms of people's perception of practice ownership. On the one hand, there's the belief there's this road to riches, and on the other hand, some believe it's a life of misery, stress and financial worries, in many cases that being perpetuated by the practice owner. Obviously, again, with many things in life, the reality is very much in between the two in almost all scenarios. But again, communicating with key staff, opening lines of communication, that becomes key to identifying in the first instance, are there people who would like to buy in, so we can then consider how we go about structuring that. So then we come on to consider who might want to buy in. Obviously, the first option, which has always been the traditional one, is assistants working within the practice. So for many years, practice owners were almost entirely vets. We have started to see others creep in over the years. So that opens you up to other practice staff members, so nurses, practice management team, and it's somewhat heartening that in more recent years practices have started to look at the value of an individual to the team rather than their specific role, and certainly we have seen non-veterinary staff buying in and really providing a valuable contribution. There's then others outside of the practice, so external third parties. That's unusual beyond the full corporate sale, but there are individuals out there who may want to provide investment to practices, and that can work in some scenarios. Another that we're seeing increasingly commonly is other practices buying into practices on retirement. The typical scenario would be a larger practice nearby, so you may have a two-partner practice. One partner is coming up to retirement. The other practice owner wishes to retain ownership, but feels either they cannot afford to buy out that individual, or they would be too exposed without the support. So another local practice, typically one not in direct competition but close enough to provide support, may take that retiring partner's stake. That could then lead to integration of the practices, sharing of management teams, maybe out of hours provision, etc. But that can work quite well where you have an existing practice owner who wants to retain ownership, but doesn't want to go it alone, and for whatever reason there are no individuals within the practice who are at a stage where they can buy in. So when considering who buys in, considering why they would want to buy in, so what drives that desire, that is a key consideration. It's always a personal thing. We see a wide range of reasons for people wanting to buy in, but commonly, obviously the obvious one that everyone perceives is that the financial aspects, the returns that an individual expects to obtain from buying in, that is a key consideration, but largely for many just to an extent that it needs to be a financially sensible decision. It needs to provide sufficient returns to repay any borrowings. It needs to also provide returns over a medium to longer term to make that individual better off. But money isn't the sole reason for most buying in. It's looking at other non-financial factors which become important. So a sense of control. You'll often see people buying in feel that they can make a difference, that ability to shape and have some control over their own destiny. Status is another thing. It's perhaps not as positive a thing for the practice, but again it depends on the individual. But standing, perception of peers is important to some. That feeling of being involved, being in partnership, the camaraderie that brings, the enthusiasm, again, that's something that we see commonly. Quite often as well, you see individuals feel that they should buy in without any of the other justifications and a real commitment. That is certainly an aspect where warning bells should sound, and you need to be very careful with pursuing with someone who is just buying in because they feel they should rather than because they really want to. So that then brings us on to who are the right people to buy in. Something of an elephant test. It's difficult to explain, but you'll know it when you see it, undoubtedly. And this also applies for people who are looking to buy in. Are the current business owners the right people for you to be in business with? You need to have those conversations. You need to assess that fit, and you'll know if it's right. The key thing is they're not always the ones that can afford to buy in, and certainly the key has to be judging the person, not their wallet. If you've got someone who you really believe can drive the practice forward, then you will make it work for them to buy in. Someone who feels they should buy in and has the financial means to, whilst that can be attractive in terms of it simplifies a lot of the initial buy-in considerations, that can lead to problems down the line. Ultimately, you need people that will bring skills to the table, some of which existing partners may not have. They may have ideas, they may have newfound enthusiasm. Ultimately, you need them to take a long term view. Buying into a business is not about what will happen over the next 6 to 12 months, it's about what will happen over the next 5 to 10 years and beyond. There are short term fluctuations, so they need to be commercial in their thinking and approach, but they also need to be compassionate and empathetic when appropriate, particularly in dealing with staff. And that transition from staff member to practice owner, it is not an easy one, and that's something that those buying in need help with, but they also need to be mindful of the impact on the practice. So there's a whole wide range of considerations there, but the key is it's about bringing people in who you really feel can help take the practice to the next level, push it forward. So, as importantly as identifying the right people to bring in, is identifying the wrong people to bring in so that those are not pursued. So, who are the wrong people? If people are overly persistent without really bringing a justification, they just keep on chipping away. Those people you need to be incredibly careful of, because if they're doing that without a sound and reasoned argument, and it's simply persistence, that in almost all cases will carry on after they're in. That doesn't lead to a healthy environment for the business to move forward. As we've said before, those who have the means to buy in are not necessarily the ones that should buy in, and it does come back to, I know I've said it before, but I will reaffirm it because it's a key person. You have to judge the individual and their skill set, not their wallet. Ultimately, you need to look at how negotiations are handled. We have seen practices in the past where they believe they've got the right person to buy in, but they've then become incredibly difficult during the negotiations. Now, we have to be sensible. It's a massive financial decision, both for those selling and buying in. It's going to be difficult at times, but if there isn't an effort by that individual to compromise and recognize that they are buying into a business and this is the beginning of what is hopefully a long-term relationship, if there's significant conflict during those negotiations, then again that should be a warning sign, because if that's how the individual is going to act before they come into the business, then there is every likelihood that they'll continue to act on that basis after they've bought in. That can then lead to a period of conflict, and ultimately that won't end well, and there'll be significant issues for the business in the meantime. So just wrapping up on that point of the wrong people to buy in, ultimately, using an analogy, square pegs rarely fit into round holes. So ultimately, you need to try and get people that are a best fit. It's never going to be a perfect fit, but I guess where you would see this is perhaps sometimes practice owners forcing the issue because perhaps they've got a young assistant or a newer assistant to the practice, it's not necessarily an age thing, who they believe would be the right person to take the business forward. But there's a long-standing senior assistant who's been incredibly loyal, and they feel nervous about that new individual jumping over the long-standing member of staff. The long-standing member of staff has already been overlooked for partnership or to buy into the practice for various factors. Perhaps they've turned it down in the past, but through a sense of ultimately loyalty or being seen to do the right thing, you see in instances where to be able to bring on board the person who the practice believes is right, they will allow the person who they have reservations over in terms of being practice owners to buy in either at the same time or before. It all comes from the sentiment of trying to be seen to be doing the right thing, but ultimately that could also be seen as ducking the issue, and again that can lead to more significant issues down the line. So therefore, obviously, communication to that loyal member of staff becomes key, discussing their role, but it's much better to hit the issue head on at the outset than take the easy option now, but have further issues down the line. So having identified the individual, what then are the criteria for them coming in? So historically, used to be very much an invitation-only club, more a rite of passage as much as anything. The most senior assistant would wait for the senior partner to retire, and then they would buy in as partner, and the next person would then move up the line so that they became the next partner in waiting. That is very much become an outdated concept, and it's more important now to have open discussions with all members of staff around their aspirations. Clearly, there is little benefit to anyone in promising something that's never going to happen, but having that career mapping process, ultimately underpinned by an appraisal process where there is an open forum for staff to discuss their aspirations, that then allows practice owners to manage the aspirations of those who perhaps aren't seen as future practice owners, or even aren't seen as having the ability to make the step that their aspirations are, and therefore it's looking carefully at all aspects of the staff management, but as part of that, identifying those individuals who aspire to be practice owners, who are seen as potential practice owners. So you can start at an early stage with development. Perhaps there's some external CPD and training, perhaps it's getting them more involved in certain aspects. So all of that needs to be considered. Once the individual has been identified, it's then a case of considering what is going to be offered to them in terms of the percentage stake. How is that going to look? Obviously, that is when we start to explore funding issues that individual may have. So do they start with a minority stake? Do they have right to buy further shares in the future? How are those shares valued in terms of the development of the practice that they'll have had a contribution in once buying in? So those are all the factors that we then need to start to consider after the individual's been identified. So as we touched on earlier, partnership succession used to be very much dead man's shoes in terms of a one in, one out concept, and then as a practice grew, perhaps they would take on a further partner to help ease the management load, or perhaps there was a case of they had two people coming up through who they didn't want to split, so it was one out, two in. That's very much an outdated concept, with less people wanting to buy in, higher valuations, expecting an individual to be able to buy out the retiring individual is ultimately going to fail in many circumstances. So therefore, looking at potentially bringing people in earlier, and also looking at the funding aspects that we've touched on in previous webinars in terms of the practice providing some of the funding, because it may well be that you have a situation whereby you have someone coming up to retirement, you have people waiting in the wings to buy in, but they're not quite ready. So therefore the practice needs to step in to be able to provide that funding for the payout. Also turning to the individual, how long, so looking at a qualifying time, can very often work well. That doesn't need to be set out in a set number of months, but just looking at allowing the relationship time to develop before you take the step of practice ownership. So work together for a period, call it a courtship period if you like, but ultimately that's allowing you to test out the skill set before they buy in and test how they work in real life, and also for them to check they can work with you. Increasingly we're seeing practices bring potential practice owners into senior roles, potentially as directors or potentially as managers, and giving them much of the role and responsibility that they anticipate both buy-in for, say, a 12 to 24 month period, to allow both parties to see how that works, check that it's right for the prospective practice owner, check that you can work with them, allow them to check that they're happy with the way the practice operates, give them some more information, check it's an environment that they are comfortable with, in order that you can scope each other out and see how things operate. It's never going to fully replicate the dynamics once a buy-in's completed, but certainly it's likely to give you far more insight as to what the future relationship will look like than simply having someone come into the practice and buy in immediately, or have them work at the practice for a number of years but not give them any management involvement, and then allow them to buy in, and they can, if you're not careful, become very much burdened then with the management aspects if they've had no exposure to it prior to their buy-in. So an issue that I just want to briefly touch on is remuneration post buy-in. Historically, practices have been structured as equal partnerships, all owned by vets. So let's say, for instance, you have 3 vets working in the practice full time, splitting the profits 3 ways. At that stage, you are mirroring input, investment, and financial return in terms of the profit sharing. So the opportunity or the potential for disagreement, dispute, people to feel undervalued in terms of profit sharing is limited. Yes, ultimately you can still have the issue where one feels that their input is greater than the other two, but with those aspects largely mirrored, that equality does help significantly. However, we have to be practical. That's not the way the world is going. It's not the way things operate in business. You need to look and consider reduced ownership. You will also have individuals owning practices, particularly if you look at non-veterinary practice owners, where the market value of their input is different, and that needs to be recognised. So you have to have a prior market rate salary, because if you simply divide profits by way of equity ownership, that distorts the remuneration. It simply won't work. So the starting point has to be that they have to be market rate prior salaries. That's important, with equity ownership then determining the split of the residual profit share. That can still lead to anomalies, and care needs to be taken to not get bogged down into what the salaries are, or no, more importantly, how the salaries move in the future. Ultimately, looking at the analogy of a practice profits being a cake, you want practice owners driving forward to push the practice to improve profits, so that ultimately they have a bigger cake on which their slice is based, rather than endlessly debating between them how big a slice of the cake they get. Because, well, okay, one person will win, but for one person to win, another person has to lose, whereas driving the practice forward, everyone wins. One area that we have seen work is having equity ownership pro rata to that market value salary, because that can give an equitable outcome in terms of starting to, again, continue with the historic concept of mirroring investment, the value of the input, and therefore the profit share. But that can be very difficult to manage, particularly if you've got people who can't afford to buy in that full equity stake on reduced shares, and also if there are fluctuations year on year. So ultimately, it perhaps shouldn't be as big an issue as it is in practice. You need to hit it head on. You need to agree a starting framework, and then also the parameters for which salaries are going to be reviewed on an annual basis, so that you can then set that to one side and collectively focus on driving the practice forward. So just finally summing up on making it work, some of the practicalities. We've acknowledged that shares may need to be purchased in increments. It may be that individuals simply buy an initial minority stake, and that is where they sit, that's where they're comfortable. But we need to agree the parameters at the outset of what's being offered now and what may be offered in the future. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to give guarantees, but there has to be clarity. If there are going to be shares available in the future, then that needs to be set out clearly. If the shares that are being offered now are all that is guaranteed to be available, then that needs to be set out clearly. There can, of course, be the option to buy more shares in the future as the opportunity presents itself, but the individuals buying in need to come in on a clear understanding of what they are guaranteed and what may happen but isn't guaranteed. As we've touched on in the previous slide, the remuneration, the profit sharing, the commerciality needs to come first. That needs to work rather than being purely tax driven. We can then look at the tax planning aspects as a secondary step, and there are always plenty of opportunities to manage an individual's overall tax burden depending on personal circumstances. But the starting point has to be get the profit sharing right, get the valuation right, agree the funding, then look at the tax aspects. That is individual to each practice, and therefore is not something that we've explored in detail here. Once you've got the agreements, you then need to look at how they're being structured and make sure that they're documented. So the legal documents become important. The shareholders agreement, that's your key document which sets out the ownership terms. So what does the share ownership entitle to an individual to? when they want to leave, what notice periods they have to give, how are the shares valued, how are disputes resolved, how are decisions made between the shareholders. There's a whole raft of those key important aspects. They need to be agreed within a shareholders agreement, and that agreement needs to be agreed and signed at the point of buy-in. Do not leave it as we all get on well, we'll sort that at some point when we get around to it. Fortunately, quite often that works for most practices, but where it doesn't work and a dispute arises, inevitably where a shareholders agreement isn't there, that just makes a process become more protracted, more costly, and more divisive. So having that rule book, if you like, agreed and in place at the outset is of fundamental importance. Sitting alongside that, we then need to consider the appropriateness of what is required in terms of employment contracts, service agreements, and the like. Obviously, a key aspect in terms of those legal documents is whether or not anti-embarrassment provisions are required. So they sit around, as I've touched on in one of the previous webinars, making a potential uplift payment to an individual who's reduced their share or retired when a practice is sold within a predefined period post that share transaction. So consideration around those clauses and ensuring they're incorporated into the appropriate legal documents is again another important consideration. So ultimately, summing up, the aims of succession planning need to be around having everyone in the team with a common goal focused on achieving that. You need a team approach, driving efficiency, driving the development of the practice. Also, letting each member do what they do well. Don't have everyone getting involved in everything. So again, when looking at succession planning, you're looking to bring in new skill sets. You don't want a group of shareholders who are broadly clones of each other. You want individuals who bring something different to the party. Ultimately, practice owners don't have to be best friends, but there needs to be that trust between them. They need to believe that their people aren't working with their own agendas, that they're working for that common goal focus and to drive the business forward. So that brings this webinar to an end. Hopefully the slides we've covered today have been useful for those of you looking at the detail of succession planning and that step of bringing somebody in, and also for those of you who are prospective practice owners, hopefully it's given an understanding of the key questions you need to be asking so that all of that can be brought together. Now, as I've mentioned in the previous webinars, if anyone has any queries, please feel free to contact me by email as set out below. Would also be more than happy to arrange a conversation or come and meet with practices to discuss how we may be able to work with them in terms of their succession planning and help them develop that and take it forward. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Steve, for another great webinar. I hope that through these webinars you have seen that there are indeed alternatives to the corporate sellout. And whilst they might not suit all practice owners and might not always be easy, they can offer a more lucrative alternative, whilst enabling vets and other veterinary staff to retain control of the businesses in which we all love to work. The key is to think beyond the multiple. If you sell shares in your business to other key staff members or other non-corporate external investors, you are unlikely to achieve the multiples currently on offer. But if you do this over a period of years and you continue to grow your business, Steve has shown how your returns in the meantime can more than offset the lower multiples that you might achieve in the future. And you will have kept your business under the control of the people who care about it most. You might even retain your shareholding well into your retirement. Alongside all of this, there is the VetSure Support Network, helping practices like yours to deliver great growth year on year. Practice owners tell us that there are no vets out there who want to buy their businesses, that they can't afford it. But our findings suggest otherwise. We do need to think differently though, beyond the traditional equity partnership models. We need to have discussions with our current team and new employees. We need to look beyond vets and think about other key team members. And we need to set up business structures that allow such individuals to afford to buy in over time. We can't just wait in vain for that perfect partner with very deep pockets. I hope that Steve has started a few of you on this journey. Whilst there are plenty of parties willing to discuss with practice owners the potential benefits of selling now, there is also a risk that individuals are not considering the relative benefits of retaining ownership, either for the next 5, 10 or 25 years. This webinar series is aimed at presenting a balanced view to consider the relative merits of selling versus staying on as an owner and developing a structure that allows vets, other key staff members or other individuals to buy into the practice business over time. We will be continuing these discussions over the course of 2019 and beyond, with our think tank event in May focusing on this critical subject. If you want to come along, please express your interest now. If you want any information about Think Tank, how VetSure can help you and your practice, then please contact us by telephone or email. Or visit the link on this slide to identify the veterinary relationship manager in your area so that you can arrange a meeting. Thanks again for your time and attention.